And so the question I'm trying to ask myself to really define best fit customers is, what are the characteristics of a target account that make them really care a lot about that differentiated value? It's the companies that really put a high price on that value that say, I really, really need that. And by extension, they're super easy to market to, they're super easy to sell to.
Welcome to the Human Insight Podcast, where we help you bridge the empathy gap to bring you a valuable, new understanding of some of the most innovative ideas and trends shaping the future of business and customer experience.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janelle Estes, Chief Insights Officer at UserTesting, and today we're thrilled to welcome April Dunford, a tech executive, board member, CEO and founder of Ambient Strategy, and author of Obviously Awesome: How to Nail Product Positioning so Customers Get It, Buy It, Love It. Thanks so much for joining us today, April, and welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Can you give us an overview of yourself, your background, and even what's keeping you busy these days?
Sure. My background is I spent 25 years as a repeat vice president of marketing at a series of tech startups. I think in total I did 7. 6 of those were acquired, and which resulted me working at a bunch of big companies like IBM. And about 5-6 years ago, I transitioned to consulting. So today I'm a positioning consultant. I work only with growing tech companies. My focus is really on B2B, and that's what's keeping me busy right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure you have a ton of perspective to share based on the experiences of working at 7 tech companies that were acquired by bigger companies. And the B2B marketing space is really fascinating. You recently tweeted, speaking of B2B marketing, you recently tweeted, the 2 big hard things B2B product marketers need are to nail positioning and the sales pitch. All the rest of it flows from those 2 things.
Yeah.
Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I feel like, I don't know if you feel this, but I feel like we're having a bit of a product marketing renaissance at the moment. Like, my first job was in product marketing, but I remember there being years where I never bumped into another product marketer. Like that was kind of a weird thing. Nobody had that job. People knew what product managers were and what marketers were, but product marketers were a bit of a weird thing. And right now I feel like product marketing is hot. Like I get more calls from companies looking to hire product marketers right now than anything else. So I think that product marketing is hot. But we do have this discussion a lot about what do product marketers actually do, because there's overlap between what they do in marketing and what they do in product management. And, and I was having a conversation with a really smart senior marketing person that I know, and we were talking about, what do product marketers do? And we circled around 2 things. Like, first of all, positioning, I feel like, is kind of the big strategic thing that product marketing needs to not necessarily own, because I feel like positioning is something that product marketing doesn't get to just cook that up on their own. And they need input from sales and product and other parts of the organization, but they need to be the shepherds of it. Like they need to be able to make sure it gets executed across the rest of the organization. So positioning is kind of this foundation cornerstone thing that product marketing needs to get their arms around. And then in my opinion, very closely tied to that is, how do we translate that positioning into a story that works for sales, not just marketing, but also for sales if you're in B2B. And so if you get your arms around both of those things, everything else downstream is in my opinion, downstream from that and a bit more tactical. If we're talking about messaging and content and sales support and all the other things that your product marketers might be doing, the starting point is sort of, there's positioning and there's the sales story. Everything else is downhill. That's kind of, at least that's my opinion of it.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. In a variety of roles at UserTesting, I've definitely been pulled into sales conversations and being employee number 90 something, we're now at 800 or so. I remember even being part of the crew that actually created and crafted the sales pitch before we had real product marketers like we have now. And so, yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think it's so hard to do it well. I remember this viral, it was a Medium post called The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen.
Yes.
Do you remember this one? I think it was Zora's.
Yes, yes. I've read this one before. And that post made me laugh a lot because the whole pretext of it was, we figured out the best way to build a sales deck. And where we got that idea was I listened to my friend who was in sales at the coffee shop. I'm like, holy cow, man. Like we've got decades and decades of sales data, sales research, marketing data, marketing research. And that's how we're going to build a sales pitch? Like based on like my friend at the coffee shop said, hey, this structure works for us. And that's how we're going to do it. Like that just kind of blew my mind. I was like, that's where we are at the state of this right now, that we're not building the structure based on data. We're not building it on any sort of cumulative thing of what works. It's like my friend said this works and now we're doing it. And the thing got like 9,000 bajillion likes on Medium. And I was like, that's how bad we are at this. Yeah.
That's amazing.
That guy who wrote that post is probably listening to this podcast going, what? Wait. That's my genius work there. But yeah, really, like when you think about it, we actually know what makes a good sales pitch. We know this because the data tells us. And we've had that data for decades. And what the data tells us is that what a customer really wants in a B2B software sales pitch is they actually want to understand the market. And the reason they want to understand the market is in B2B software sales, most of the time, your buyer has never bought a product like yours before. Think about it, right? Like your boss wakes up and says, hey, go find me a CRM. And you're like, I've never bought a CRM before. I don't know what's a good CRM, what's not a good CRM. I don't know. Maybe I've used a CRM. I've never purchased one. I don't know what the state of the art is. I don't know who should be on my short list. And so when a customer comes to you and has a first sales meeting with you, they want to know about your stuff for sure. They've got a list of requirements, maybe, but they've got other companies they're looking at too. And what they really want to understand is how do you fit in the market versus all these other folks that I'm looking at, and give me a way to segment this market so that I can make sure that I'm making a good choice here. And the data tells us that what customers want is insight into the market. And what they love is a sales rep that can come and paint that picture for them and says, look, the market shakes out like this. These guys are really good for this thing. These guys are really good for this thing. And we're really good for this. And here's why that's important for a company like you. And if you can successfully do that in a sales pitch, then I think you've got something that's really golden.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Which at its core is a lot of positioning. You're positioning yourself, yourself within the landscape. Like if we go back to that Medium post, the greatest sales pitch I ever saw. Well, it's a lousy sales pitch because it refuses to admit there are any competitors. And that might work in B2C, but in B2B, we don't sell anything without customers looking at alternatives. So they already know there's competitors. You can ignore them, but your customers aren't. And all you're doing is leaving yourself open to, you're missing an opportunity actually to position the way you approach the problem versus the way all the other companies in this space approach the problem, which is really what your customer wants in that sales pitch. So why not give it to them?
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I think a big part of it, and actually I'd be curious to get your perspective on this, a big part of making sure that your positioning lands is to actually listen before you go into your pitching mode. And I can't tell you how many times I've been on calls where you just go straight into, here's everything about us, right? And it's sort of like, how do you think about that balance in terms of how much you listen before you, show up and throw up, as they say?
Yeah, exactly. So if we think about it this way, right, like what a customer wants is this insight into the market. I think if we think about a good sales pitch, in my opinion, a good sales pitch has two phases to it. There's sort of this, what I would call the setup phase, and then there's the follow through. And the setup phase is not about you. Like the setup phase is about, let's talk about the problem. And not really the problem. It's more sort of like, let's put a boundary around this conversation. Like, what are we here to talk about? And usually what you want to do in that setup phase is kind of say, look, like we work with companies like you all the time. And we see this kind of stuff happening in the market. What do you guys see? And we'll say, look, like we see there's this problem in the market. And when we look at other companies, we see them approaching it in one of these three different ways. What have you guys tried any of these approaches? And we see the pluses and minuses of these approaches that look like this. What do you think? Do you agree? And what you're trying to do in this setup phase is have this conversation with the customer about their point of view on the world versus your point of view on the world. And can we get that aligned? Because if we can't, then I've got nothing to sell you. And so a really good sales setup says, all right, we're here to talk about this challenge you're having, right? And usually you're defining the challenge in a way that, the customer is like, yes, that's the challenge we're having. Like if I have to sell you on the challenge, then this is a bad sales pitch. And then, but what we want to get into in this setup really is, look, you have choices and there's different approaches to solving this problem. And we kind of clump the approaches like this, and the pluses and minuses look like this for different kinds of companies. But tell me, right? Like, tell me, have you tried any of these approaches? Would you agree that they clump out like this? Have we missed something? We think the pluses and minuses look like this. What do you think? And what we should be getting towards in this conversation is at the end, you as the salesperson are trying to do a little bit of discovery, but also a bit of education in here in a conversational way where you're saying, look, like we kind of see the world like this. Does this jive with the way you see the world? Because the way we see the world, there's a gap here. And our stuff is designed to fill the gap, but we're not talking about our stuff yet. What we see is a gap here. And what we see is, look, if we really wanted to solve this problem, we'd have the best of all these different approaches. I'd have this without this and this without this, right? And if your client is not right at the end of that setup, then there's no point in pitching your stuff. Like there's no point. If I can't get them aligned to my point of view on the world, then, but and only at that point where the customer leans across and says, yeah, I wish I had this without this and that and this without this, like this best of all worlds. If that existed, I like that. And then you say, great, okay, now let's talk about us.
Yeah.
Then you move into us, right? Then it's like, okay, now I'm going to, here's who we are. This is the value we deliver. This is how we deliver it. Like, so I think what we tend to miss is that setup. We just go straight to the demo. Like most startups that I see, they're like, okay, let me show you my stuff. And they jump straight into the demo, but there isn't any kind of establishment at the beginning about like, why are we here? What is the point of this meeting?
Right. And I mean, and back to the tweet, I was just asking you about, the two things to nail are positioning and the sales pitch. And it, you just sort of illustrated that as well here. You mentioned
they're really tied, right? I can't express my point of view on the market until I understand, well, what are the other approaches and how is our approach different? And why does that matter for our best fit customers? Otherwise I can't actually do this setup piece. I need to understand that. And I can't do the follow through piece if I don't understand our differentiated value, which is the crux of the follow-up piece. And those two things are generally missing in a typical startup sales pitch. Just go straight to features. Here's a feature. Here's another feature. Here's another feature. Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned startups a couple of times, which is obviously critical for startups to be thinking about and honing messaging and positioning. But is positioning just for startups? Like what other companies benefit from this?
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the thing. Every company's doing positioning, whether they're doing it consciously or not, right? You're positioning in a market. A lot of the work that I do is with what I would call growth stage startups where they've gotten to a certain stage and a certain amount of revenue, and now they've really got to smash their foot on the gas. And in order to do that, you need to get really, really crisp with the positioning. So it's often a stage where people are looking at positioning and trying to get it really crisp. But that said, there's two things to understand. Like one is we don't just carve positioning in stone and that's it. We do it once and we never come back to it. Our products are constantly changing. The market itself is changing. Our competitors are changing. The way buyers behave is changing. So naturally, our positioning is going to have to evolve over time. So back when I was a VP marketing, we would do a positioning checkup every 6 months where we'd get the cross-functional team together and we'd look at the component pieces of positioning and say, hey, has anything changed in the competitive landscape? What do our differentiated features look like? Is that different than 6 months ago because folks have caught up with us or we've released some new stuff? And then how does that impact our differentiated value? For bigger companies, the changes tend to be less frequent in terms of, if you're a bigger company and there isn't a lot of change happening in your market right now, the positioning tends to be fairly evolutionary and it happens less frequently. That said, there's a lot of things that can force a change in positioning, even if you're a really, really big company. So something like COVID hits, for example, and then you're forced to react to a giant change in the market that was unforeseen. A big acquisition will force you to change your positioning. And so a bunch of the clients I'm working with the last couple of months are big companies that have done an acquisition that are now having to go back and readjust the positioning as a result of that. Sometimes what you'll get is the market essentially changes in a way, and it's subtle over time, but all of a sudden, the market that you were strong in and winning in just kind of doesn't exist anymore and has kind of moved on to something else. And it's going to require a fairly drastic change in positioning to get people to understand that you're not that old thing anymore. You're now this new thing. So we're always working on positioning. I don't think it's just for startups, although, for a lot of startups, the positioning stuff is kind of do or die at a certain point in their life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you did mention COVID, and a lot of has changed in the last couple of years and continues to change. How is COVID, in your opinion? How has the pandemic changed the role of positioning for companies?
Well, it certainly made it an urgent thing for a lot of the companies that I'm working with. Like a lot of what I saw in the early days of COVID is companies coming to me and either they were in terrible trouble, like they were in the travel industry or, parts of the entertainment industry that were completely shut down. And they had other options of places where they could play. And what they were trying to do was a big pivot into something else in order to essentially save the business. So there was a lot of that. Then there was, at the opposite end of the spectrum, companies where things were going good, they were growing well, but then COVID hit and they happened to be in healthcare or they happened to be in virtual office stuff. And all of a sudden, COVID was just a massive accelerator. And so, they raised a bunch of money and now again, they're looking to grow really quickly. And so they want to tighten this positioning up to take advantage of this sudden influx of demand. So that happened. And then there was this kind of an in-between thing where there were companies that, served a kind of a horizontal need, but parts of their market were really dead post-COVID and parts of their market were on fire. And so they wanted to do an adjustment in the positioning to kind of refocus around the parts of their addressable market that were really going good and maybe de-emphasize the ones where there wasn't so much demand right now because that part of the economy or whatever is just not happening. So there was just a lot of change is what was happening. And so I think COVID, when it first hit, was kind of a perfect storm of outside forces that may cause you to have to react and readjust your positioning. So things were really busy. What I'm getting now is companies coming out of COVID and now seeing a bit of an adjustment again in the way buyers are behaving, in purchase priorities and things. And I'm working with a lot of companies that are doing a post-COVID adjustment. So it's super interesting. Like, I used to talk about, when I talked about positioning, I would talk about things that would happen that would cause you to adjust your positioning. And it would be things like, big competitor gets into your space or big competitor makes an acquisition and now is competing with you that wasn't competing with you before. And then I'd talk about outside forces and I'd say things like, we had the great financial crisis, or we go into a recession or something like that. But most of the time, the companies I'd be talking to, they'd be kind of like, yeah, well, we'd probably see that coming. I mean, would that really catch us by surprise. And then COVID happens and you're like, oh yeah, no, there's lots of things happen that we just don't see coming. COVID's a good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you brought up this idea that people have these beliefs that they're going to be able to see these things coming before they actually do, right? Like we're going to have some level of preparedness that, is just expected. And I think that that's it's a bias, right? That people have in their own kind of way of thinking. And so would love for you to expand a little bit on that topic of bias and how that can sometimes get in the way of how we position and even, I think specifically thinking about how you position against competition. There's an interesting role that bias plays there too.
Yeah. So most of the companies I work with, we have this kind of bias that's related to where the company came from. And so a lot of times we'll have a hard time doing the repositioning. And the friction is really that people are kind of stuck in the past a little bit. So when I do these exercises with companies, we tend to have a cross-functional team, and you see a real difference between the folks that have been at the company for a long time and the folks that are new. And the folks that have been at the company for a long time are, they tend to say things like, but that's just not what we are, or we've always been this. Whereas the newer employees don't have that baggage, right? They come in and they're like, what? No, we're not. We haven't been that for years. Like, what do you mean? Like, we're not that. That's not what we are today. So we tend to see a lot of bias that way. We got into this business to be a database and we're going to be the world's best database that does this thing. But now we're going to fast forward 5-6 years. And you know what? We're a data warehouse. We're actually not a database. And everyone's like, but we're database people. That's what we are. And it's like, well, actually, from a customer's point of view, not really. So that's the worst bias that I see is when doing positioning work is there's this pull of the past and this pull of when we started this business, we intended it to be this, even though the market's moved on, the product's really different, the competitors are really different. We launched this thing as email and what it really is team collaboration or it's chat. And that makes way more sense to position it that way. But people are a bit like, yeah, but we're email. So I think that for a lot of companies, it's really hard to let go of that baggage and look at the product really from a customer's point of view and say, I'm a customer. I've never encountered this before. I'm looking at your product for the first time. What is the best way to contextualize what we do? And it might not be the way we contextualized it 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic point. And, and even further thinking about internally, I know you mentioned customers clearly should be involved when you're developing your positioning, and I'd love to hear some tactics on ways to do that. But beyond customers, even the internal stakeholders that are involved in crafting this, can you talk a little bit about what do you recommend to organizations who are revisiting positioning or coming up with just brand new positioning? Who does that? Who's involved?
Yeah, so I really believe that positioning needs to be a team sport. It can't be something that product marketing cooks up on their own and then reveals to the rest of the organization and says, thou shalt do this positioning like this. I think you'd never get buy-in doing that, and it wouldn't be good positioning. So the reality is that different parts of the organization have very valuable things to contribute to positioning. And the best positioning is going to come about when we do it as a group facilitated exercise. So, sales knows an awful lot about what's going on in the ground. They know an awful lot about what competitors they're seeing and we're not seeing. They know that better than any other part of the organization. Product, for example, knows a lot about capabilities and how our capabilities stack up to other competitors or other options out in the market. So they need to be involved. Customer success sees a completely different view of what customers are doing. They often understand, the difference between what a customer was expecting versus what they actually got. And when they started to actually use it, here's what happened. Customer success increasingly is also involved in expansion inside of an account and how do you actually, grow your usage inside an account. So they see sales in a post-sales way. And then there's marketing that really understands about what's hitting and what's not hitting in terms terms of lead generation and what's getting people excited to have a meeting with us in the first place. So we really need to get all these groups together. And then in my opinion, you've also got like the CEO or the senior executives, they're out there pitching at conferences and often getting pulled into sales calls. They need to be positioning the product the same way too. So if we really want to get alignment across all those teams, we need to have all those teams involved. And frankly, it'll be a better result because each of those teams has something very unique to bring to the process. So in my opinion, product marketing or marketing can shepherd this, right? They can be the people that says, hey, we need to do a positioning thing. Let's get everybody together. And then, but we're going to have to work on the positioning together. We can't do it in a bubble without having all these other groups involved. And then having them involved helps them get buy-in to the whole thing. What we should get at the end is positioning that everybody's aligned on. And now we can all go execute on it. And we're all executing on the same positioning, which helps it stay really consistent across the organization. So I think this is crazy for people to try to work on this stuff where it's just marketing, or sometimes I see people where they try to do it and it's just with the CEO. And I think it's really hard to get marketing, sales, product buy-in if we're trying to do positioning, but those groups are not involved.
That makes a ton of sense. I am also wondering, as you're developing the positioning cross-functionally as a team sport, as you mentioned, how do you pull the customer into that? What have you seen to be successful with teams who have done this?
In the work that I do, one of the reasons why we have this cross-functional team together is because different parts of the organization are working with customers in different ways. For example, if I go to the sales team, if we have direct sales interacting with customers in the purchase process, sales is talking to customers every day, but having very specific conversations. So they know a lot about what's the status quo inside the account. They know a lot about what other solutions end up on the short list. So my sales team is a very good source of information to go and say, what do we got to beat in order to win a deal? Sales knows this, right? If I got a good sales team, sales knows this. When I get to customer success knows a lot about the difference between what we pitched and what customers actually got. If there's a gap there, success knows all about that because they're answering those calls every single day. Success also knows a lot about what happens after the sale and, how does that account evolve over time? So where might we expand into the account? Once they get doing this differently, what are the next things that they need? So I think customer success has a lot of customer involvement, but again, it's different, right? It's different. If I go over the product side of the thing, often product is doing a lot of customer interviews, but again, they're very focused on something else. So they're talking about differentiated features. Like, so what if we did this thing? And is that different than this? And so they know a lot about how customers prioritize functionality. And then I got marketing. Now, marketing is hopefully having some interactions with customers. In some companies, they don't do a lot of customer interaction, but they do understand how customers behave at the very beginning of the purchase cycle. So they understand what not even a prospect yet, just a suspect reacts to and doesn't react to and what they do. And so in the work that I do, it's funny, when I started consulting, I felt like what I was really going to have to do in order for us to nail positioning was I was going to have to go and do a whole bunch of customer interviews, pull a bunch of data, bring that together, and then we would use that as the starting point. And what I discovered is I'd do that and I'd spend months doing it. And then I'd get together with the executive team and I'd say, here's what I found out. And half the executive team would be like, that's interesting. Didn't know that. But the other half of the executive team was like, we paid you to do that? Dude, you could have just come and asked me. I knew that. We do this every day. How could you possibly figure this out better than us? And so the reality I came to was teams know a lot about what's going on with customers, but each group knows a different thing. What I actually have to do is get the team together and pull it out of them.
Oh, I'd love to be on a fly on the wall in some of those sessions.
Oh, yeah. So there's a lot of contention normally,
Sure.
again, because it's like, it's like that thing where, there's a group of people and we've all got blindfolds on and we're all touching a different part of the elephant. And the person who's touching the tail says it's a snake. And the person who's touching the leg says, oh, it's a tree. It's like that. Sales is over there on the tail going, no, it's this. And products over there going, no, it's this. Customer service is going, no, it's this. And so what you need is somebody that can draw the picture of the elephant and say, yeah, I see your tail is there and the trunk is there and the leg is there, but it comes together in this thing. And we don't actually have many opportunities in a company to actually bring a cross-functional team like that together and have that discussion where all the other groups get to hear what the other groups know. And so not only do we get positioning out, but we actually get this cross-pollination across the teams of, well, here's what we're seeing in sales. Oh, that's funny. Well, here's what I'm seeing in success. Oh, that's funny. Here's what I'm seeing in marketing.
Right. And I'm sure people who join those sessions, say, from a specific department, walk out with a whole new perspective of
exactly
the customer, the market, how your positioning fits, what the competitive landscape looks like.
Exactly.
Yeah, sounds amazing.
Exactly. And everybody's teaching everybody else something about that.
Yep, absolutely. So it's funny, one of our guests on season 2, Dan Storms, he's a big fan of yours. He's heads up product at Cook Unity.
Oh, cool.
And he used your book in combination with Clayton Christensen's Jobs to be Done book and build the positioning for the company. And he, if you have a chance to listen to it, it's a really great story.
Cool.
And we told him you were going to be on the show because he gave a big shout out to you and credited you for a lot of the success
awesome.
There. And he had a follow-up question, which was, could you ask April to dive more into what is a best fit customer and how have you or other companies tackled identifying them, whether it's B2B or B2C?
So this idea of best fit customer is really important. And to be honest with you, in B2C, I have no idea how you do it because B2C is not my jam at all. And in fact, I think this might be really, really hard thing to do in B2C. But let me tell you about B2B because this is something I know a lot about. So one of the first times where I had this kind of epiphany about, there's good fit customers and not good fit customers was this early in my career. And I worked at this company and I was trying to figure out what our actual competitive alternatives were. And so I did a survey of our existing customer base and I asked them, who do we compete with? And then I had a bunch of different questions, but one of the questions was, who do we compete with? And the other one was like, when you bought our product, what other things did you look at? And so I was going to I assumed I would get this nice picture of the competitive landscape. And instead what I got, so I surveyed everybody, I got a whole bunch of results. I think we had maybe 100 companies responded to this thing. And I graphed it and it was a mess. There was no pattern. It was all over the place. So I'm sitting there looking at this thing going, well, that's depressing. I haven't learned anything. Like people think we compete with all kinds of stuff here. This is a mess. And while I was all depressed about this, staring at my screen, my boss walked by and the CEO, and he says, what you doing? And I said, well, I did this survey and I'm trying to figure out competitive, who we compete with. And this is what I got. It's a bunch of junk and it doesn't actually tell me anything. And he says, and he looking at the graph and he goes, wait, who said we compete with that? And I was like, I don't know. Let me pull up the spreadsheet. I'm like, that's Bank of Montreal. And he goes, oh, Bank of Montreal. We hate Bank of Montreal. We wish we never sold Bank of Montreal. They're the worst customer we have. They're using us in some weird way. You know who I do not care what they think? I do not care what Bank of Montreal think. Take that out of there. He's like, I don't want you ever asking them what they, he's like, they're weird. They're a weird customer. We'll never sell another customer that looks like them. I'm like, okay, we'll take that out. He goes like, now I got to see your spreadsheet, April. Like, who else is on this spreadsheet? Because I think you're getting some bad data here. So I pull the spreadsheet out and he's like, oh, and he starts crossing them off. Not these people, not these people, not these. He's like, oh, this one we sold in our first month of business. They bought it for some weird use case. They're weird. Take them off. And so we crossed off a whole bunch, like maybe 20 or 30 companies out of 100. And then all of a sudden, there's the pattern. So what it taught me was that sometimes what I've got is bad data, and I'm mixing up good fit customers with bad fit customers when I'm asking questions like, what are we compared with? And so for positioning, what we're trying to get at is positioning that makes our differentiated value really sing for customers that really, really care about that differentiated value, these best fit people. So I actually don't want to pull in the data from these bad fit folks because it's going to contaminate my thinking. What I actually want to know is for the people that love us, the people that are super happy, the folks that closed, they closed with us really quickly. They didn't ask for a discount. They intuitively got what our value was all about. After the sale, they love us. Doesn't mean they never complain or challenge us, but the challenge we get from them is good, right? Because they're using the product in the way we intended. Those people I care a lot about. And every B2B company out there has a group of customers that are like that. And then they got a few that are not that. And the really dangerous part about it is often, particularly in startups, you'll get a startup that only has 20 or 30 customers, but one of them is Walmart, and it's huge, and they do half their revenue with this one big customer. And even though it's a bad fit, that customer has this massive influence over what we're doing in positioning and what we're doing everywhere else. And what we do in the workshops that I do is we'll have this conversation about who's good fit, like who is easy to sell to, who's really happy, who, recommends us without us having it. And importantly, who's not so good fit. Like, even though they might be a big customer, maybe we landed them and maybe they pay us a lot, but we don't expect to close another deal like that ever. And we'll write down the bad fit ones and we'll essentially put them in the parking lot and say, for the rest of this exercise, they don't count. So when I say, what would the customer do if we didn't exist? I don't care about Walmart. I care about everybody else. So we'll have that. So we'll do that. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when we're doing this exercise, the first thing we have to understand is what our differentiated value is. So as we're going through the exercise, we're like, okay, what would customers do if we didn't exist? What do we have capabilities wise that those alternatives don't have? And how does that translate to differentiated value? Once I have that differentiated value, then I can say, look, like I've got a solution for restaurants, and my differentiated value are these three things. And I could sell it theoretically to any restaurant on the planet, but not every restaurant cares about those three value points the same. And so the question I'm trying to ask myself to really define best fit customers is, what are the characteristics of a target account that make them really care a lot about that differentiated value? And sometimes it's easy, right? Sometimes it'll be like, oh, if you're in this particular industry, then you care a lot more about speed. And therefore that's, folks in this industry. So, but a lot of times it's not, it's horizontal, or it's a combination of things. It's like, you're this size with this business model, and if you use this other kind of software, then you actually really care a lot about this. Whereas if you don't use that software, you don't. And so this is the conversation we have in the workshops I do around best fit customers is, once we get this differentiated value, then we can have a theoretical discussion about, well, what would make a customer a really good fit for that in particular. So for example, I had this client of mine, and what they do is software that helps you execute on a strategic plan. And their big differentiated value is they make it really easy to visualize where you're tracking to the plan and where you're not tracking to the plan. So, so that's their thing. It's this easy visualization so that you can prioritize and make sure that you hit the plan, basically. So you got like an early warning system. Where are you going off the plan? Then you can correct. Now we get to this conversation about, well, who cares a lot about that? Well, you could say, anybody that has a strategic plan cares about that, right? Yeah, Yeah, I don't know about you, but I've worked at companies where we had a strategic plan and we kind of didn't care that much about it. We kind of didn't care if we hit it. We kind of didn't measure it quarterly. It was there, but it wasn't a big priority. So then we ask the thing, we say, well, if this thing really ensures that you hit it, who really cares that they really hit the plan? And you know who cares if they really hit the plan? People that got a strategic plan because they got in trouble. So you got in trouble with a regulator. You had to go to your board and say, oops, we got a fine. And what does the board say? What are you doing to fix this? And you say, don't worry, I got a new strategic plan. And the strategic plan is going to fix that. And the board says, great, come back to us in 2 months and report on that. Now, these folks really need this software, right? Because I got to go show the board and I got this nice visualization. I can show exactly how we're tracking it. I can prove all this stuff. So as a company, I might say, well, I could sell to anybody that's doing strategic planning. And, I could work with consultants that help people do a strategic plan. That would be fine. But if I really wanted to knock this thing out of the park, I could actually be looking at companies that have gotten in trouble with a regulator and then go to them and say, okay, now you got a strategic plan and you got to hit it. We're the software that's going to help you do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's sort of like helping you narrow in on the right, sorry, I'm probably going to kind of butcher the summary of this, but helping you narrow in on the companies that will find the most value
exactly
in your solution.
Exactly. They find them, it's the companies that really put a high price on that value that say, I really, really need that. And by extension, they're super easy to market to. They're super easy to sell to. And then we don't have unlimited marketing and sales resources. We want to focus those marketing and sales resources on the people that are most likely to buy.
Yeah, absolutely. Question here. One more question for you before we move into our lightning round. So, there's talk about positioning, but then we also hear about categories and category creation and category leaders. And can I just create my own category and be a leader in it? And we've all seen the example where, some executive, whether marketing, strategy, sales, says the company needs to be a category leader. And therefore we're now category leaders in left-handed widgets, let's say. Yeah.
A world leader in left-handed widgets.
That's right. So what's the difference between positioning and categories in your perspective?
Well, the thing that people kind of miss about categories is what is the job of a market category? The job of a market category is it helps customers make sense of where you fit in the overall market. So if you come to me and say, hey, I got a thing and it's a CRM. I know what a CRM is. And I'll make a whole bunch of assumptions about you. Like, oh, you're a CRM. You must compete with Salesforce. I'll make an assumption about what your price is. I'll say, well, you must sell to the head of sales. You must sell to VP sales. I'll make an assumption about features you've got and stuff. And so it's a shorthand that helps me figure out what you are. And so done well, market category sets off a bunch of assumptions in the minds of customers that are true about my product. And I don't have to teach you too much about it. You're, oh, okay, CRM, I get what that is. Now we can move on to how you're different and how you're better. So this idea of creating a market category, when we do positioning, we can either position in an existing category or create a new one. So if we're positioning in an existing category, we kind of have two choices there. We can either position ourselves as the leader of the whole category, like I just say unqualified, I'm a CRM. Well, that's basically like me walking in and declaring war on Mark Benioff, right? Like that's it. You're like, okay, how are you better than Salesforce? But most of the time we wouldn't do that. If there's an established market leader, like even when I was at IBM and we had a lot of money and resources to go do this stuff, we generally wouldn't take on an established market leader in a new market. What we'd do to start is we'd carve off a piece of the market that was underserved, establish ourselves there, and then grow from there until we got big enough that we were number two, and then we would attack number one. So most folks, the easiest way to be successful in a market that's new, that you're entering, is to start in an underserved market where the market's already well understood. Because I can say, well, I'm CRM for dogs. And you're like, oh, well, that's different. I can talk about why that, how I'm serving that market better than Salesforce. So most of the companies we know today, and in fact, most successful tech companies, if you look at and I actually pulled these numbers once just to validate this, but if you look at companies that have IPO'd in the last 5 years, tech companies that have IPO'd in the last 5 years, 93% of those companies are positioned as a niche play in a large existing market category. Most of those companies are doing at least 100 million revenue, lots of them doing way more than that. So people think that niche means small. It doesn't at all. And in fact, if you look, that the overwhelming majority of successful companies that actually live to be big enough to go public are positioning themselves as a niche play, and like 92%, literally 93%.